Story 1. I used to work the night shift at a gas station right off a highway. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't uneasy that an armed robbery could occur, but luckily one never did. However, there was one night and one experience that came close to that in terms of sheer terror. I arrived around 8 and the other two guys left right after I got there. There usually wasn't that much to do other than stocking some of the shelves in our little convenience store area. It usually didn't take me more than half an hour, and I'd usually knock it out in the first part of my shift. Long story short, by 10 I had finished all my duties aside from just being there overnight and checking out any customers who came in. There'd usually be a few soon after my shift started, but it was rare for anyone to come in after 11 or so. I'd usually just be on my phone or doing homework, as I was in college at the time. Fast forward to 2 a.m. and I just finished my homework. I put my laptop and notebook back in my backpack and decided to see if I could go to sleep. There was a chair near the space behind the counter leading to the employees only section, so I usually just go there so I'd be aware of anyone entering the store. I was in the chair for less than 5 minutes when I noticed lights shining on the back wall of the store. They were headlights, meaning that someone had just pulled up. I got up and walked over to the cash register to where I could get a better view. The customer hadn't parked at one of the pumps, rather, they had parked in one of the spots directly in front of the building. This wasn't particularly unusual, since some people would come inside and use the restroom and make a purchase before going out to get gas. I kept looking forward in anticipation of whoever was in the car getting out, but no one did. They just sat there, with their headlights on. I tried to peer into the car to see who might be inside, but I couldn't make anything out. After what seemed like 2 minutes, the headlights turned off, but still, no one got out of the car. Maybe they were making a phone call. I didn't really know. Either way, I was starting to get sketched out, and I'd already played through the scenario of a robbery several times in my head. It seemed like 10 minutes passed and still nothing happened. That had never happened before. A thought occurred to me that maybe whoever was in the car was trying to sleep. I suppose that could have made sense, but I still found it odd, especially with the lights of the store shining on them. But what happened next was nothing short of terrifying. The person must have turned on one of the overhead lights in their car, or else turned on a flashlight, because out of the darkness I saw a person wearing a clown mask. My blood ran cold as I realized this probably was a robbery. I didn't know what I should do. Should I wait for them to come inside, or go outside with my hands up? It didn't really matter though, since there was no way I was stepping outside of the counter. 30 seconds later the light went off, and I just stood there, frozen in place. Like before, nothing happened. Then maybe 5 minutes later the car's headlights turned on again. They backed up, and then pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the highway. I just stood there, dumbfounded. It dawned on me that this must have been some kind of prank, and the person inside the car was filming me and would upload the video. Still, it was a very strange prank, and they didn't even come into the store. Needless to say, I wasn't getting to sleep anytime soon, so I just started watching random videos on my phone. 30 minutes later, around 3 a.m. I think, I started to hear some kind of noise. I know that sounds vague, but it was hard to describe. It didn't sound like footsteps or banging, rather, it was kind of a muffled, scraping sound. At first I thought it was either the refrigerator or freezer, but no, that wasn't it. I checked the bathrooms, but the sound wasn't coming from there either. I returned to behind the counter, confused. Given what had already happened that night, I was becoming alarmed. There was only one thing left to do, check the outside of the building. I really didn't want to do that, so I just sat behind the counter, procrastinating as long as I could. The sound kept on for like 10 minutes, and it seemed like whatever it was wouldn't stop on its own, so I figured I had to check. I went over to the front doors and windows and looked out, but I couldn't see anything. There was no one parked either at the building or by the pumps. I decided to lock the doors and head out through the back door in the employees only section. I went back there and pressed my ear against the metal. The sound was a bit louder now, but I still had no idea what it could be. I quietly unlocked the door and cracked it open. I didn't see anything. I should mention that the gas station backed up to a woodsy area, so if anyone had been there, they could easily duck out of sight. Needless to say, that did nothing to help me calm down, and on the contrary, was a frequent source of anxiety. I could hear the sound a bit more clearly now. It seemed like something was being dragged inside of a bag or a box. It seemed to be coming from the side of the building, too. I stopped, contemplating my options. My manager was not a nice person, to put it kindly. and I highly doubted that he'd offer any kind of support. For some reason, I didn't want to call the cops just yet either. Instead, I crept slowly towards the side of the building. My life flashed before my eyes when, just as I was about to round the corner, that same person in the clown mask popped out. I fell backwards, then started to scamper away. That person just watched me from around the corner. I never even saw their lower body. The sound abruptly stopped, and I heard footsteps racing around the building as the person ducked back out of view. 10 seconds later, I saw them run around the opposite corner into the woods. I ran back inside and locked the door, and then I turned the lights off. I was still out of breath as I called my manager and the cops. The story really ends there. The cops came and checked the place out, and I gave a statement, but without the license plate number, which I'd somehow managed to forget to check, they couldn't really do anything. My manager just seemed glad nothing was stolen or broken, so there was that. Uncharacteristically, he even let me avoid doing the night shift for a while. The next 2 workers arrived around 7, which was when I left, and I tried to get some sleep before my classes that day. I managed to close my eyes for a bit, but the sight of that clown mask was embedded deep in my nightmares. It wasn't even a particularly scary mask, just something you'd find at a party or Halloween store. However, it was the situation that made it downright terrifying. I was also left with a lot of unanswered questions. Mostly, who was that person? But also, why did they drive away and then come back? And how did they get back? Did they just park somewhere further down the highway and cut back through the woods? What were they using to make that sound? Was this really just a prank? I left that job several months later and have since graduated, and I've never had the pleasure of experiencing anything like that ever again. I still can't help but wonder how things might have gone differently that night, and just how close I was to losing my life. Story 2. I used to work for DoorDash back in college to bring in a little extra money. I wouldn't say I delivered a whole lot, but I did use it off and on throughout my undergraduate career. As you might imagine, I've had my fair share of odd experiences, but there was one night and one delivery that was downright horrifying. Because of how my class schedule worked out this one semester, I'd sometimes pick up late night deliveries, including the one on the night in question. I was just watching a movie in my dorm room around 1 a.m. when I got the notification that someone requested a delivery. It was from the McDonald's right by campus, and the address for delivery was about 10 minutes away. I accepted the request, and after getting the food, I got back in my car and followed my GPS. I hadn't been to this particular location before, and it wasn't a nice neighborhood. There were run-down looking houses with unmowed lawns, and some of them had junk sitting in the front yard. I pulled up to the end of this one street and double-checked the address. I was at the right spot. I updated the app and then got out of my car with the food and started walking to the front door. This particular house was run down looking like the others, but at least there were lights on, including the porch lights. I walked up to the front door and knocked, but no one answered. I announced, "I have your food," and then rang the doorbell. Still nothing. I checked the app again and saw that I still hadn't received any messages from the customer. I decided to message them through the app, but just as I was about to do so, the door cracked open. I got a whiff of a putrid odor immediately, which smelled like cigarette smoke combined with rotting meat. I had to stop myself from gagging as I said, "I have your food," again. An older man peeked out from behind the door, and it was actually creepy. The man looked to be in his 50s and was bald and missing some teeth. He didn't have a beard, but he wasn't clean-shaven either. He gave me a smile, which was a disturbing sight in itself, and told me to come in. There was no way I was going in there, so I told him, "That's all right, I have your food right here." It was only one bag with 2 small hamburgers and 10 chicken McNuggets. The man apparently ignored what I said, because he told me to put the food on the table so that he and his friends could eat it. I was immediately sketched out, and told him that it was our policy to give customers the food and then leave. Normally I wouldn't mind putting the food somewhere for someone, but in this situation I absolutely did mind. As the man walked away from the door, he pulled it open more to reveal an old wooden table and kind of a dining room area. It was hard to make it out exactly, because the house was filthy and it seemed like he was a hoarder. The table was only about 10 feet away, so the thought crossed my mind of just quickly setting the food on it and leaving. However, the little voice in my head wouldn't let me. I stayed where I was at the door and insisted that the man just take the food. Unfortunately, he'd left my field of view and didn't answer. I didn't care anymore, so I just set the food right inside the doorway. But even that was a mistake. because no sooner than I bent down, a hand reached out from behind the door and grabbed my arm. I screamed, but the person didn't let go. Instead, another hand grabbed me, and I was being dragged through the doorway. In the process, the door opened wider, and I saw both the same man as before, as well as another man. The other one looked to be a bit younger, but wasn't anyone you'd want to meet either. My life flashed before my eyes as I struggled, and as I've never been in a fight before, I was out of my mind. Somehow, my instincts told me to wait until they pulled me closer and then kick as hard as I could. Against all odds, that worked. I kicked at the leg of the first man, who started screaming and let go. I used that as leverage to pull myself back around the door, causing the second man to hit the inside of the door and also let go. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, and when I got to my car, I floored it. I almost choked when I looked around and saw those men chasing after me. One of them must have thrown something at my car because I heard a loud thud a few seconds later. I didn't stop driving until I got back to my dorm building. Once I was inside and the door locked behind me, I called the police. About 10 minutes later, 2 cops showed up, and I went out to speak with them. I gave a statement, including the address I just delivered to, and they went over to check it out. Now, here's where things get stranger. Apparently an older woman had been living there, but she'd been evicted 2 months ago for failure to pay her mortgage. She had moved in with her daughter in another city, and when the police got in contact with her, she said she had no idea who either of those 2 men could be. The credit card they had used for the account was apparently also stolen. Ultimately, those 2 men were never caught, and it still freaks me out. Thank God they didn't have my name, address, or phone number. I kept using DoorDash after that, but never went out late at night again. I like to think I've moved past this experience, but I can't help but wonder what those 2 men were planning to do to me, and what would have happened if I hadn't gotten away. Story 3. Back in high school, I worked at a local video store. I know that sounds ancient, and it was. This was in the 90s, and in fact, most of what we had were VHSs. Our particular video store didn't rent anything rated X. In hindsight, that probably cost us a lot of business, but as a teenage girl employee, I personally preferred it, as I imagine there would have been a lot more shady characters coming in if we did. I mention that fact because it plays a part in the story, which was truly terrifying. One Friday night, I was working the late shift with 2 other employees. It was a little past 9, and our store closed at 10, and we'd usually go home soon after that. The other people with me that night were Darren, a guy in his 30s, and Chrissy, a girl in her 20s. Everything was going as usual, and Darren and Chrissy were checking the tapes and putting them back on the shelves. I was restocking some of the merchandise at the front counter, which was mostly candy. The last time I was in the stockroom, I heard a ding, meaning that a customer walked in, so I walked back up to the front. The man who entered looked to be in his 40s and was wearing dark glasses, a black t-shirt about 2 sizes too small, and ripped jeans. He had longer, greasy hair and didn't look clean-shaven. When he saw me walk back to the counter, he asked in a gruff voice if we rented any special videos. I assumed what he meant and told him that we didn't. He next asked me if we rented any R-rated movies. I told him we did, and told him that the rating would be on the covers of the VHS tapes that we had on the racks. Next, the man asked if we had a list of movies rated R. At first I thought he was trying to be incognito with the dark glasses, but now I was getting more significantly weirded out. We did in fact keep such a list, but in this particular instance I didn't feel like extending this conversation any more than I had to. Instead, I asked him if he was looking for a particular movie. I can't remember which one he told me, but I pointed to one of the aisles and he thanked me and walked over. Neither Darren nor Chrissy were in the public area, so I assumed they had finished what they needed or wanted to do and were hanging out in the back. I kept my eye on the customer, who I assumed was just going to get one of the VHSs and return to the counter. However, he just stood there, seemingly looking at the cover. But it didn't seem like he was reading the text on the cover, he was just staring at it. I was so intrigued by his behavior that I didn't even realize a whole minute had gone by. I felt slightly concerned by the situation, so I radioed Darren and asked him to meet me at the front counter. A few moments later he walked up, past the customer who was still just staring at the video. I motioned for him to turn around with me, and whispered what was going on. I also asked Darren if he'd ever seen him before, and Darren shook his head. Darren, who was a genuinely good person, took the lead and asked the man if he needed help with anything. The man turned to him and said, "I'm good," but then resumed looking at the cover. Darren and I were both at a loss. Since it was getting close to closing time, Darren told him we were about to close and that he needed to make a selection. The dude said, okay, but still just stood there. I think Darren and I both sensed something was about to go down. The man then sprinted towards us and lunged at Darren, apparently trying to tackle him from behind the counter. Darren backed up and managed to avoid the man's grasp, but a moment later the man lifted his leg up and did kind of a roll over the counter. I screamed, and Chrissy came running out of the back. She then stopped and screamed too. What happened next will forever be burned into my memory. The man drew a knife from his pocket and managed to slash Darren's arm. My fight or flight compelled me to hit the man as hard as I could on the back. He then fell forward onto the counter, and Darren managed another solid whack with his other elbow. The man yelped in pain. Darren knocked the knife out of his hand, and though the man still struggled, Darren and I were enough to pin him down. Chrissy was crying, but still managed to call 911, and by the time the cops arrived, the man had stopped struggling. They put him in handcuffs and let him out of the store, and an ambulance came and took Darren away. Our manager showed up soon after that, and me, Chrissy, and her just stood there, trying to work through our emotions of what just happened. The man was easily convicted. I think one of the charges was assault with a deadly weapon, but there were other ones too, and he obviously ended up with jail time. Somewhat surprisingly, we all continued to work at the store, and when Darren returned after a few days, he didn't seem fazed. I'm eternally grateful for what he did, and sometimes I feel bad that I never kept up with him. I didn't even know that much about him. In any case, I'm just glad he ended up working with us that night, because if he hadn't been there, I'm not sure what that man would have done to me.